We've asked Jim to do if he will come and tape it because we value the kinds of things you say so much. I hope it's okay.
All right. All right. Bring it back to Penn. Maybe they'll learn something over there as well. Everybody up there?
You don't see the yellow light on there, do you?
Actually, as Dr. Eisen knows from last time he did this with our most meeting, this goes out to chapters around the country, and so there's literally an audience of about 1,000 people that these copies go to.
Yeah.
And so it's not restricted just locally. And given this, we make this available to the other chapters as an example of second chance, as opposed to TRIO, which through funding is actually sponsoring this as a presentation library program.
Right.
We have 12 presentations so far this year that we've recorded and put out in binders for these chapters to make available. So this will be added to that. Thank you.
Yeah. And Doctor, the only thing, on the other thing before you get started, do you have anything that you can send to me electronically so I could send out to the team, also help me with my notes?
About
the kinds of things you're going to talk about.
what I'm going to talk about? Okay.
Or if you want to
All right,
just
well,
reference something.
Sure.
that
Once I finish and I know what I've talked about.
I like that.
I'm not saying it's stream of consciousness, but...
Yes. With that being said, you're on.
Okay. So I believe you asked me to talk about sort of the year in transplant, the future, those sort of things.
Yes.
It's kind of my sort of State of the Union address or annual...
That's exactly what it is.
So there have been some things that have happened, and I'd like to share them with you. In the realm of new immunosuppression, some of you may have been in the Certican trial, the everolimus trial, which is a new immunosuppressive agent. It's actually been around for about 13 years. Clinical trial started 12 years ago. Was published in the New England Journal 7 years ago. Compared to, at that time, azathioprine plus cyclosporin showed less rejection and less of the transplant coronary disease and less CMV. So it was not approved by the Food and Drug Administration. They were concerned, I think appropriately, that there was an interaction between Certican or everolimus and cyclosporin that made kidney function abnormal. Was approved everywhere in Europe and around the world. The only countries that have not approved it are the United States, Canada, and Britain. So another clinical trial was done. Actually two. One was in kidneys, one was in hearts. And what was done this time was in the patients who got the everolimus, Certican, they received much lower doses of cyclosporin so that their kidneys were not damaged. The heart trial was completed in July. The results will be analyzed beginning at the end of the summer. So once the last patient has been followed for a full year. The kidney study finished earlier, and the results showed that, in fact, kidney function was not worse with the combination of Certican and cyclosporin. The rejection rate was about the same, maybe even a little bit better in patients who got the Certican. So that was submitted to the Food and Drug Administration. They approved Certican. Well, the committee recommended approving it in December. I was down there to address some of the potential cardiovascular issues, mainly related to abnormalities in triglycerides that occur with these kind of drugs. The drug is similar to rapamune or sirolimus, but we think it may have fewer side effects, and certainly has been studied more extensively. So it is likely that the Food and Drug Administration will give its approval and this drug will be released in the United States within the next few months. We'll go down to the FDA sometime the end of this year, beginning of next year, to look for the heart transplant indication. Now, this doesn't mean once a drug is approved, doctors can use off-label use of drugs, which means that doctors could potentially, if they wanted to, use this drug. But I think at this point, some people may want to wait until the heart transplant approval occurs. And that probably won't be till the end of the year, beginning of next year. But some patients may end up on it. Now in Europe, it's become very popular. They use it a lot, and they've had really great success. It's been used for almost 10 years in Europe clinically. So That's from what I hear, it's reduced the rejection rate, reduced the transplant coronary artery rate. So we'll have to see what happens here. There was another drug that was reviewed by the Food and Drug Administration last week. It is betalbicep, B-E-T-A-L-B-E-C-E-P-T. Is that correct, Rennie? Yes. He's my fact checker. Believe it or not. So this drug has a brand new mechanism. So if you look at immunosuppression, the standard drugs that we use, cyclosporin and Prograf, work by blocking the consequences of the immune system, the cells of the immune system, recognizing the foreign proteins on the transplanted heart. And so there's a protein on the lymphocytes that binds to these proteins, or more complicated, recognizes them, and then produces a series of molecular changes, and those in turn produce proteins that make the T cells rev up and proliferate or increase their numbers. Cyclosporin, and the key protein in that is calcineurin. So cyclosporin and Prograf are calcineurin inhibitors and block that from happening. And then there's another mechanism that's used. Cellcept uses this, Imuran uses this, and everolimus and sirolimus use this as well, which is they block proliferation through another mechanism, blocking essentially development of DNA. I always, when I give these kind of talks, and Rennie is shaking his head, yes, I know I'm on the right track. So that's another mechanism. But as things are even more complicated, because it turns out that in order to get a T cell, the immune system, the recipient's immune system, to recognize and act against a foreign, transplanted heart or kidney, you actually have to have two things happen. One is you have to have this protein that recognizes that it's from the cell is from somebody else, and the other is a second signal that has to go off at the same time. As it turns out, if you block the second signal, but the first signal is still active. So in other words, the cell recognizes that the lymphocyte or the immune system recognizes that the cells are from somebody else, but the second signal doesn't happen, those immune cells will shut down. So think about that. Wouldn't it be really cool if you could shut down just the part of the immune system that reacts to your transplanted cells and leave everything else intact? Wouldn't that be good? That'd be a great idea. So people have worked on antibodies that block that, what we call a second signal. And good news is in rats and in monkeys it works just as we predicted. You give this drug, next thing you know, the immune system doesn't recognize the transplanted organ, and you can cut down or eliminate immunosuppression, and the rats and the monkeys live happily ever after. Fortunately for humans, it's a little bit more complicated, and that did not quite end up happening with this drug betalbicep, which again is the first drug to block the second signal. But it does seem to reduce the rejection rate. And the committee that reviewed it for the Food and Drug Administration on March 1st approved it for kidney transplantation. There may be a heart transplant study in the next year or so. So we'll have to see. But that's another kind of exciting development. Maybe not quite as exciting as you would have hoped. I mean, it's not a home run, but it may be a single or a double. Certainly anything else that we could use that would cut down, where we could cut down the doses of the other immunosuppressives and reduce side effects, high blood pressure, infection, those sort of things, would be very welcome. So we'll have to see how the FDA approves this and for what use, and then there'll probably, as I mentioned, be a heart transplant study in the next few years, 2 years. So that's immunosuppression. That's the new things on the horizon. And then in terms of recognizing or diagnosing transplant rejection, there are two things. One, the Alamap has been around. There was a big clinical trial where people were randomly assigned to actually have their care taken, directed using AlloMap scores, or have their care directed the standard way, which is biopsies. And these are for people who were 6 months, up 6 months to 5 years out from transplant. The data will be presented in about 6 weeks at the International Society of Heart and Lung Transplantation in Chicago. So we'll have to see what that shows, whether using the AlloMap is as good as using the using just the traditional way, using biopsies. But I think that's going to generate a lot of excitement if, in fact, AlloMap is as good as biopsies, because then you can say we can start cutting out even more biopsies. And then there's another diagnostic test. So before AlloMap, late 90s, early 21st century, when I was at Temple, we were involved in a clinical trial where we would analyze what changes in chemicals in the air that people exhale. I kid you not. This is the real stuff. So we had this system where people would blow into this device and it would collect the air, and then it would go to a central place where they would look for certain markers of, essentially, of immune activation. So in a way, it's kind of like the AlloMap, except it's looking at what's exhaled as opposed to what's in the blood. And it turns out that, as with the AlloMap, it was a successful way of identifying people who are at low risk of rejection and might not need biopsies. It wasn't developed to the same degree that the AlloMap was. The studies were smaller. But the guy who invented this, who's in Staten Island, you know, who knew that clever ideas came from Staten Island? Got funding from the National Institutes of Health to do a bigger trial. So, and we're going to be involved in that as well. So I think that's going to be very, very exciting. And it may be that with a combination of two, you know, relatively non-invasive techniques, or actually they are non-invasive techniques, analyzing the air that people breathe and breathe out, and changes in the blood, we might be able to totally eliminate biopsies or even further decrease them and more rationally adjust immunosuppression. So that's kind of where we are in terms of new diagnostic techniques. And then finally, I want to talk about the tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people who aren't fortunate enough to get heart transplants. So, you know, as you know, heart transplants are reserved for people who we can't help any further. We've exhausted everything that we can do medically. It used to be that those people would end up on intravenous medicines like milrinone, and if a heart didn't become available, we would just kind of watch them dwindle away. Not very gratifying. And actually, when I was at the University of Pennsylvania in the early 90s, the Daily Pennsylvanian wanted to follow somebody waiting for transplant, and they picked somebody like that, and it was kind of a very sad thing. And students would come and kind of, you know, trying to make everybody feel better. It was very sad. The guy passed away. In the early 90s, though, ventricular assist devices became available as bridges to transplant. And I was lucky enough to be involved very early on when I moved to Temple. This was unbelievable. You had people who otherwise would have died. They were failing on milrinone, and you put in ventricular assist devices, and they got up and walked around and were able to exercise and get into better shape and get transplanted. You know, the problem with those devices was they were very big, they had a tendency to fail, and people would get infected. But at least if they got infected, you take the device out, give people antibiotics, and they would get better. And then it was thought, well, we're never going to do more than probably never going to do more, despite Jim and everybody else's best efforts, more than a few thousand heart transplants a year. In fact, the peak number in this region was 1997, when about 160 heart transplants were done. You know, last year I think we did about half that number. Some of that's good news because there aren't as many people on the list. There are, you know, medications, pacemakers, things that can prevent people from needing transplants. But clearly the number of donor organs has not gone up. And yet you have these, the number of people with class 4 heart failure in the United States is almost 250,000. So maybe, you know, 98% of people will never get an opportunity to get a heart. And a lot of these people are older. A lot of them have other medical problems that might not make them good heart transplant candidates, but they still want to live and they still should live, and they have a terrible disease whose prognosis is as bad as the worst cancers, as bad as pancreatic cancer, the worst pancreatic cancer. So in the late 90s, the idea came up, why not use these ventricular assist devices instead of bridges to transplant, use them in people who aren't transplant candidates, and just leave them in what's called destination therapy. That was like the, I guess the term would be final destination, although that kind of has, anyone's seen those movies with people, it's not a good, so we just call them destination therapy. And so there was a clinical trial that was published about 8 years ago that showed that people who got the ventricular assist devices did better than people who didn't in terms of survival, and they actually felt better, they had better exercise tolerance. And at 1 year, about 52% of people who got ventricular assist devices were alive versus 23% who did not, who just were on the best medical therapy. Now remember, transplant, 85, 90% 1 year survival. So ventricular assist devices were better than medical therapy, but not anywhere near transplant. And part of the problem was these devices were big, they tended to fail, they tended to get infected, and they were designed for a short haul. They were designed to keep people alive as a bridge to transplant for a few months or maybe a few years, but not indefinitely. So it's kind of like a Boeing 737, designed for a short haul. Take it from New York to Chicago. If you want to take it from New York to Sydney, probably not going to make it. But there are newer devices now that were introduced in the past few years that have a totally different mechanism. So the mechanism of the older devices, they would sort of pump like a heart. The newer devices are more like jet engines, and they have continuous rotations. You had one. So what they do is they spin at about 9,500 to 10,000 RPMs. They're about the size of a D battery. They're easier to put in, and other than requiring blood thinner, they're much less likely to get infected. So there was a clinical trial. We were involved in this, randomly assigning people who were not transplant candidates, destination therapy, to get either the older device or the newer device. The older device, again, 1 year survival about 52%. The newer device, 1 year survival was almost 70%, and in the subsequent years it didn't decline. And a lot of us think that based on better patient selection and more experienced surgeons, can probably push to get that up into the 80s. So almost approaching transplant. So we'll always have transplant. Transplant will always be the number one choice. But for people who aren't good transplant candidates, I think this may be the next option. When we had the older ventricular assist devices, this whole destination therapy thing just never caught on, because even those of us who were involved in the clinical trials felt, well, it's a difficult thing to put one of those devices in. With the newer device and the superiority that's been shown, I think a lot of us believe that this is the time for destination therapy. Some of the big transplant centers are actually putting more devices in for destination therapy than they are doing transplants. So the Cleveland Clinic last year did 65 heart transplants, probably the third biggest in the country. They put in 70 ventricular assist devices as destination therapy, more than anybody else. So I think this is something that's going to start catching on, and there are going to be even newer devices that may be even more, for example, might be able to put it not through open heart surgery, but perhaps in the cardiac cath lab. So that's kind of where we are. It's a very exciting time in transplantation and in cardiology. Jim?
Why, if we get to a point where the artificial device has as least success, if not more so success than the transplanted heart, why would you say it's still not preferred?
Well, I think if we
No
get to
immune
the point
suppression
where
drugs, I
it's
assume?
superior, if we get to the point where it's superior, then we may end up not doing transplants. I think that it's going to be a while before that happens.
Agreed.
But if we could put in one of these devices, have 95% survival over a long period of time. Now remember, transplant's been around for many decades in its present, status. So we know an awful lot about transplant. It would take we'd need probably several decades of a device that at 1 year has a survival equal to transplant before we know what's going on.
Now, it seems from my experience over the years that most of the patients who die after transplant die from other things, get hit by a car or other conditions. What percent actually die because of a heart problem versus if you have a mechanical heart that's not going to have those problems versus, you know, other ways of dying? Is there something there?
Mortality in the first year post-transplant is probably about 10%. It includes a wide variety of things. Maybe rejection, maybe failure of the transplant early on. Infection is probably the biggest cause. In the ventricular assist devices, infection is still a cause as well. It's caused for a different reason. It's caused not because you're getting immunosuppressive therapy, but because you've had open heart surgery and you still have the wire that comes out. It may be that the future of these devices are ones that are totally implantable, that can then be charged across the skin, and that may significantly reduce the infection rate. So, I don't think we're finished in terms of designing these devices. And you're right, if we get to the point where we have long-term survival that is equal to or exceeds transplant, then I think then transplant will kind of go by the wayside. People will, decades in the future will say, can you believe the crazy stuff they used to do? We used to joke around that,
That's very true.
in my 80s, I'd be kind of going on rounds and, talking about cyclosporin, and people kind of look at me like, doctor, I haven't made cyclosporin in decades.
Doctor, what kind of longevity are people with the turbine type devices?
At least 5 years. They haven't been out that long, but at least 5 years is what I'm talking about. The longest somebody has had one of these devices has been about 8 years, and he died of something non-cardiac.
What about all the discussions they're having about the stem cell and the regrowth and the regeneration?
Yes.
Regeneration.
Yes. So stem cells are sort of slowly being evaluated. We actually have a clinical trial here, but it's not in people with bad heart failure, people with kind of moderate-sized heart attacks. It's a randomized trial of stem cells versus placebo. We're the only ones in the region to be fortunate enough to do this. There have been some studies looking at sicker patients. The results have not been. All right, I'm going to back up and repeat everything I said.
No, you're not.
Apparently, it's going to be on video, so it's going to be on YouTube. There have been studies. They've been kind of neutral in terms of benefits. Maybe a slight improvement in the ejection fraction, but in terms of measures of outcome, really not much of an improvement. And if you use certain kinds of cells derived from the skeletal muscles, they actually seem to don't work that well at all. And in fact, they put people at risk of sudden cardiac death. So these people always get defibrillators. But what's happening is that there are a number of centers that have been funded through the American Heart Association, National Institutes of Health, to study stem cells in the laboratory and then in experimental animals. And only then, when they identify the appropriate stem cells, only then will they then do clinical trials. So I think we are going to see stem cells. It's probably not going to be for a number of things, not just cardiac, but it's probably not going to be therapeutically for, I would guess, a minimum of 10 years for heart failure.
And just beyond that, we've seen, or I've seen documentaries where they've shown a man who lost his finger in particular from the first knuckle down. There was some sort of a mixture of, I don't know what, because I'm not a doctor. The powder was put on, and within a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, the entire finger grew back, nail and all.
Yeah, I saw that about a month ago.
Really?
His fingers
Well,
were
I'm looking to help your, your factor.
That's pretty cool. Well, I mean, it's certainly certain species. I'm not aware so much of a mammalian species, but lizards and alligators and all things can grow back extremities.
What Mark is really getting at is the veterans coming back with the war wounds.
Yes.
And they're actually thinking the potential of putting.
Well, there may well be stem cells that would allow this sort of thing. Look, as it turns out, there probably are stem cells in the body that are recruited when somebody has a heart attack or has a heart transplant as a way to try to repair damage. And the problem is that it's too little too late. We don't have enough stem cells and they come in too late. We know this, the body has other reparative mechanisms that are too little too late as well. Perfect example is if somebody develops a heart attack and there's a clot across the artery. It turns out if you look a week later, do an angiogram a week later, that clot's dissolved. It's just that in order for there to be clinical benefit, it has to be dissolved within the first few minutes to hours, and not days later. So again, too little, too late. Probably we didn't evolve that way because we didn't need it, because people didn't survive to the point where they needed, where they developed heart failure or where they developed heart attacks. But we know with therapy like the clot dissolving medicines and now angioplasty and stents, we basically facilitate what the body does at a very slow pace. And so that's the thought with stem cells, is maybe we're going to be doing the same thing that that the body can do, only we're going to be facilitating it in terms of numbers and in terms of much shorter time span. One of the genes that is abnormal in the Alimab test as a result of rejection is a gene that's involved in the maturation of stem cells. It's kind of interesting. So maybe somebody has rejection, one of the things that happens is the cell gets activated in response to damage in the heart.
Is anybody working on growing hearts, the way they grow bladders?
Yeah, people are doing that. I mean, the best success has been with the bladder. Bladders are a very simple organ compared to the heart, but people are trying to do that with the heart as well. They're trying to do it, probably the easiest way is to develop a scaffold and then use stem cells to try to grow the heart. And there's some preliminary evidence that may be possible. Kind of like the Star Trek thing. I don't know if you ever watched Star Trek Next Generation, but there was kind of in the middle of this whole series, they revealed that Jean-Luc Picard actually had a fatal injury. His heart was punctured, badly damaged in a fight with some 9-foot alien, and they just fixed his heart. They grew up a new heart and put in a new heart, and then periodically, I guess those new hearts from stem cells still are not as good as the original, so you have to get them replaced. So they showed him, going for his, I guess it's every 10 years, going for his 10-year replacement. Change the battery, change the spark plugs, on a new heart.
Question for you. Can you address with the new technology, whether or not it's heart transplant, the LVADs and so forth, with the age differentiation? I would assume that a lot of this could impact depending on your age as well, right? I mean,
right. So
go ahead.
So transplants are for younger people in general. We've done some maybe in people in the early 70s, but biologically they certainly are younger. But you're right that the majority of people with heart failure are older. The number of older people is going up. And I guess that's defined by, if you're a member of AARP, if you're a baby boomer, baby boomers are getting older, so the number of people with heart failure is going up. And many of these people may end up developing significant heart failure when they're past the point where they would be considered a reasonable transplant candidate.
And that's 64, 65?
Maybe 70, sometimes early 70s.
Early 70s?
A few years ago, Robert Altman got an award at the Oscars. He was 81 at the time. He revealed he got a heart transplant 10 years before. So it depends what shape. But let's say you're in your mid to late 70s and you're otherwise in good shape except for heart failure. That's where these devices could come in.
You have to understand the life expectancy 20, 30 years ago was a lot less. So none of these things happened because the person was already dead. Since then, life expectancy has come up to such a point that we really are looking at people so much differently than we had to look at them years and years ago. Again, 40 years ago, maybe even 50 years ago, 68 was kind of the range or the average of death. It's not any longer.
Can you also, thank you very much. Can you also speak to, just a few months ago, Robert Wood Johnson did something extremely great by implanting the implanted heart or something like that?
So they put in an artificial heart, and actually if you go down the hall here, and instead of making a left to go to the elevator, you make a right, you will see a picture of that artificial heart, because that was studied here at Hahnemann in the late 90s, early 99, 2000. And what happens there is that the whole heart's taken out, and this device that you can see down there is put in. It doesn't actually have any external wires. It's energized across the skin.
Okay.
And it was designed for people whose life expectancy was 30 days.
Right.
And the thought is that you'd extend their life expectancy to 60, they'd live in 60 days. It's very modest. Really for people who are too sick for VADs, too
Right.
sick for transplants. The problem is a lot of people, because they're sick, a lot of them had problems afterward. The survival wasn't that great. The one person who was done here, I think, lived about 6 months.
Yes. And the gentleman at Robert Johnson, I believe, lived for about 3.
Yeah, I don't know. That was actually, so the FDA approved this finally.
Right.
Initially, they didn't approve it. Then they approved it as a sort of last-ditch Hail Mary procedure. And I think Robert Johnson was the first place to put it in outside of the clinical trial.
Right.
I don't know how long the patient lasted.
It's my understanding he didn't last very long. In fact, I chatted briefly with the surgeon who actually did it just last Saturday night, and he said it was very interesting. I mean, it's just to be able to do that.
Yeah, yeah.
But
I guess
I believe the patient died of something else though, later on.
Yeah, I mean, patients died of infection and stroke. You know, they don't have a heart anymore, so
Right.
they're not going to die unless the device stops, which has not happened. I guess the question you have to ask yourself is whether, and there actually are models to look at this, how long these devices improve survival. So using certain models, there's one called the Seattle heart failure model. If you factor in somebody with advanced heart failure, factor in using the older LVAD, improve survival by 10 months. Actually, if you're an oncologist taking care of people with advanced cancer, you think that's great. I saw a talk given by an oncologist from Sloan Kettering where they were talking about people with the most advanced breast cancer, unresponsive to everything. They had this chemotherapeutic regimen, prolonged people's survival by 6 months. Everybody got out and celebrated. You know, we had an LVAD, older LVAD, that improved survival by 10 months, and we didn't really adopt it with great alacrity. If you put in the newer LVAD, it improved survival by at least 4 years and maybe longer. So there was a definite change. And I suspect if you put it, you have to kind of figure out how these artificial hearts would benefit people. If you're putting them in people for 3 months, if that's the sort of median benefit, and I believe that probably was in the clinical trial too, was something about 2 to 3 months. Is that something that's worth it? Is that something that we can all afford to do? Is it beneficial for the patient? It's one thing to give somebody a heart transplant, have them live 15, 20 years or 30 years, see grandchildren born, grow up, dance with their kids. It's another thing to keep somebody alive just for 2 to 3 months in critical condition.
Because I would assume that 2 or 3 months, number one, you don't have the strength to get out there. Let's stop that. And I'm
Yeah,
not
that's
sure
right. I mean,
exactly
a
how
lot
you
of these
can
people
enjoy
never left the
life.
hospital. And
Right.
the one person here actually did leave the hospital. I think he was on Oprah. He was shown shopping and going to church, and then he had a stroke. And so I'm not sure where that device is going to be ultimately fit in. There are artificial hearts that are used as bridges to transplant, and there's talk about perhaps using them, different types, that perhaps using them as destination therapy. But the reality is putting those devices in, it's still much more difficult than putting in the smaller LVAD. And if the device fails, you're done. Sudden cardiac death. If a VAD fails, in most circumstances you can come in the hospital and can get it fixed. You have your own heart that's weak, but still able to pump. And you can potentially have it changed out. It's easier actually to do that with the newer device, because the initial surgery isn't that complicated.
Last one?
Last one what? Last question, you gotta have the last word. Yes, go ahead.
No, I'm not gonna have the last word.
Okay.
Got a couple other questions yet, so not the last. Go ahead.
All right, so you're not gonna have, so you wanna wait, I'll get Jim's question. Go ahead, Jim.
Whichever way you want.
What's the impact on the hospital business when you replace something like regular biopsies with a blood draw? That, in fact, most of the money in that is going to the AlloMap people as opposed to the hospital. What happens to your business model?
Our business model probably has to change a little bit. And you're right, there are some people who were very reluctant to adopt this because they actually do biopsies not in the hospital, they do them as outpatients, so they get to bill for everything, global and technical, professional. So, there's some people who aren't very happy about that because this may be the major part of their income. On the other hand, if it's equally good to do a blood test as do a biopsy, you have to do the right thing.
Right.
And I have to say, Tenet has never ever said anything about it. They never kind of called up and said, "What the hell are you guys doing?"
But I believe because of political reasons or Medicare or whatever, you couldn't do it here anymore, right? You had to go over to the...
Well, you had to go, and that's not just because of that, it's for other tests as well. You had to
Right.
go, at one point you had to go to someplace outside
away
of here.
from, yes.
Yeah.
Has that been fixed now?
I believe it is fixed, actually.
I thought I'd heard it was
Yeah.
fixed, that's why.
It was one of these things, where the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Right.
Good
Good
intentions.
But the people who paid the consequence were patients.
Mhm.
And the other thing was that, it wasn't initially approved by the FDA, but now it is. So an FDA-approved blood test, the history of medicine is often replacing very invasive procedures with much less invasive procedures. And, yeah, it's great to do the invasive procedures, but ultimately, they need to be replaced if they aren't offered an advantage.
The other thing that's very related to what you're talking about, it's off the subject for today, so I'm not suggesting we go there, but the whole judgment of value for dollar given some very expensive procedures. There's an interesting article in Business Week last week. Front cover just has the word life disappearing, and it's something about a $600,000 death. And it's about a good 4-page article about a cancer situation and what they went through prolonging the life of the spouse that cost $600,000, which when I looked at it, I said $600,000, that's a drop in the bucket in our world sometimes. My brother went in for 11 days at Robert Wood Johnson. They did nothing. And the bill was $220,000. So, but that's the big issue today with healthcare, right? And some of the argument of whether it's worth it.
I think that's correct, and whether we like it or not, Republican or Democrat, their costs are going to have to be reined in. That's just the way it is. We spend 17% of our GDP on healthcare. Just can't do that anymore. The French, the Germans spend 10%. And on top of that, the French all smoke, and they still seem to do as well as we do. So imagine if they didn't smoke, they'd live forever.
Germans drink, right?
What's that? Maybe that's better. So there are things. So that's why I'm saying, somebody who's critically ill at death's door, putting in artificial hearts in everybody, we could bankrupt the country doing that sort of thing for not much of a benefit. So, and the other thing is, I think eventually there are going to be assessments of whether some of the therapies we use are cost effective.
It becomes ethical in determining what do you want out of life.
Right.
Are you owed this? And right now, once you start talking about money, it's altogether different.
So, Mr. Harvard.
Some of the high costs of medical is the profit margin of the insurance companies too.
It's all part of it.
Well, I think it's part of it, and certainly that needs to be controlled, but also there needs to be control in technology, to be honest with you. And some of it is, it's very complicated, and I'm not an expert, and I'll put in my 2 cents about tort reform as well, though I understand it's not, maybe 5%, but I think the cost may be hidden because it's not just the cost of settling or fighting or dealing with lawsuits, it's what's ingrained in physicians, which is the defensive medicine, which drives up the cost. So, that does need to be rationalized as well. So there's a lot of things, but there needs to be a rational use of technology. The oncologists deal with this because they have some incredibly expensive drugs, usually biological drugs, that may prolong survival by 3 or 6 months. Again, there's a little bit of a difference in mindset between oncologists and cardiologists. We think you have a VAD that improves your survival by 3 months. We're not going to put it in anybody. We're going to say, forget about it. Oncologists, maybe a little bit different, but there needs to be an evaluation of that. So we'll have to see.
This problem with Alamat, as far as the billing and everything, that forces you to go to a separate place, is that actually totally solved, or is that part of the new health bill?
I think it's solved, actually. I think it was solved beforehand. It was a separate Medicare thing.
Yes, it was Medicare.
Yeah. All right. Bernard, you get the last question.
Okay, let's talk about preventative medicine, so that heart attacks and things like that are just not going to be as prevalent as before. To me, if you can take care of yourself to a point that you never have to come here, I think that's...
Well, so that's true, and I think, the reality is that, I'm not sure people hear enough about this, but there has been, over the past 40 years, tremendous gains in terms of preventive care. So, if we had the same rate of heart attacks now that we did in 1972, we'd have over 1 million heart attacks a year. We don't, we have 400,000. Cut the number by 60%. And the 400,000, if you were to then adjust it by age, would probably be even less, because the population was younger on average in the 70s than now, the aging of the baby boomers. So, exercise, quitting smoking, controlling hypertension, diabetes, controlling cholesterol and lipids, all those things have had tremendous impacts. And I think if we could cut smoking down to 10%, that would have a huge impact, not just in terms of survival, but also in terms of cost of care. We would further cut down not just heart disease, but emphysema, lung cancer. So, it's important for prevention to continue. The dark cloud on the horizon is the childhood obesity epidemic, which, many people feel several decades from now may erase all of these gains. So that has to be dealt with. That's a big issue. The NFL, the American Heart Association, have programs to encourage kids to go out and exercise.
Just 2 days ago, I was able to do some research, and I saw an article on the 14 things you must know about, it could be preventative care, and it was all about heart disease and exercise and the hypertension, and there are 14 things in there. I don't remember them all, but I would encourage everyone to read it.
Yeah, no, it makes sense, and I think that everybody else reads it too, because there's a lot that people can do themselves to improve their outcomes,
Exactly.
likelihood of heart disease.
And
by heart disease, we're not talking about people who have, cardiomyopathies, caused by viruses. That's one of these out of the blue things. But the much larger group of the people with blockages in the arteries, coronary artery disease.
So I would encourage all of you to, well, it's not on the website yet. I'll put it on there later tonight. That's the last one I just sent out.
That's the 14
The
numbers
14
you're supposed to
things
track.
that you should know
So you'll put that on the website?
Pardon
Yeah.
me?
You'll put that on the website so everybody knows?
Yep.
Yes, right. It'll be on the
Okay.
website later this afternoon or tomorrow.
Very good.
Even though doing preventive medicine, I knew it was in my family. So I ate the same diet I eat now, which is heart healthy. Dropped exercise, didn't exercise much, getting back to it, walking home, did everything I knew, measured blood pressure, cholesterol, like perfect. The thing is, I was in a very high stress job.
Well, stress is also, stress is also an issue. It's harder to quantify, and it's harder to modify too. There is talk about, these various stress reduction programs, and I think they make sense, but, again, nothing is going to be 100%. So it's not like we have this prevention program and heart disease will disappear, and Dr. Eisen will then be able to go out fishing, take a European tour, write a book of memoirs or something like that. So
They're not gonna let you.
Yeah, but I did it for years.
but-
Right.
The thing is, years.
Even before we put it on the website, each of you got a copy, and Dick sent it out just a couple days ago. So you may want
220 people.
220 people. So you just may want to look at it, read that article.
it's good. And again,
I
the changes in the frequency and numbers of not just heart attack but stroke from the 70s to now is really dramatic. And the therapies we have, it used to be when I was in training as a resident or a fellow, we would see people come in with massive heart attacks. We still see that, but not as frequently as we used to because of prevention, also because of some of the, the aggressive angioplasty stents and things like that. When I was final closing comment, when I was a third-year medical student, I was asked to see a patient on rotation who was a 23-year-old girl. She was my age, very, very pretty woman with advanced heart failure. Could not lie down, sitting up, bolt upright. And the things that we had to offer her back then were Lasix and Digitalis or Digoxin, which is a 200-year-old drug. And that was it. And she died a few months later. And I just think about that, nowadays, somebody like this, we start on carvedilol and ACE inhibitors, and, more likely than not, would get dramatically better, and, maybe her heart would go back to normal, she'd be able to do everything she wants to. And the worst came to worst, if it didn't work, get a heart transplant.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, that's 30 years ago.
My turn to be late.
Your turn to be late. Okay. Well, you can watch this on YouTube.
Okay.
It'll be the same place as the Super Bowl commercial.
Yeah.
Okay.
Doctor, I do,
So it
it's
is
on-
great.
And Channel 7 is on now, so you can get Channel 7.
All right.
Remember that issue? Cablevision and Channel 7, they wouldn't let,
Oh, yes,
Channel 7
yes,
was going
yes.
off, right. Anyway, Doctor, we do appreciate it.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Doctor,
Latest version.
Cool. Thanks.
Doctor, if you don't mind, if you can send something out to me, I would appreciate it so I can get it out.
Okay. So Rennie is going to remind me of what I talked about today, so he's going to give me a
Is
list.
that right?
So if it sounds crazy,
It always
blame
comes
me.
back to me. See how this works?
Well,
I'm
as
a conscience.
as an internal control, Hank Gross will.
Okay, thank you, sir. Okay, that was very good, thanks. We have one more item